Welcome back to the update. I am Tiffany.
I'm Daniel.
And I'm Jai.
As always, we thank you for being with us here today. It's the end of the week. Who is stoked? I know we are. Today we'll be going around the world telling you all about the current things going on. Some good, others not so good. And then we'll talk about the United Nations. And after that, we switch to things Arizona, so hang tight. The update will be back in just a moment. Today we are going around the world and checking out, that's right, you guessed it, the haps with the maps. We are starting out in Europe today, talking about the Ukrainian war. Russian President Putin announced partial mobilization in Russia, meaning the Russian president mobilized forces in response to what he believes are external threats to national security, calling upon 300,000 reservists. Protests have been breaking out all over Russia in response to the mobilization because the act is in direct conflict with an earlier commitment from Putin, stating he would not send reservists to fight. Speaking at the UN General Assembly for the first time as U.S. President, President Joe Biden said Russia's war on Ukraine was about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, and that Putin shamelessly violated the core tenets of the UN Charter by ordering his troops to invade Ukraine, and then world leaders like Britain's Prime Minister Liz Truss and European Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen have released joint statements condemning his actions. Now, Moscow-backed separatists in Ukraine, the area where they still recognize Russia as the motherland, they are holding referendums deciding if they want to join Russia, and if approved, would allow Russia to annex the captured Ukrainian territory. On a positive note, Russia did release 10 POWs, or prisoners of war, who were captured in Ukraine. Among the released prisoners were American, British, Swedish, Croatian, and Moroccan nationals. The Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with Poland, have closed their borders Monday to most Russian citizens in response to the domestic support in Russia for the war in Ukraine. Now we want to take a look how life is for those in Ukraine. I mean, we can only imagine the unrest with all of the deaths, injuries, relocations, and the mass exodus due to the war. There have been reports of mass grave sites. You may remember us reporting about the ones in Bucha and Mariupol earlier this year. There may be another located in the eastern areas of Ukraine with a reported site of around 400 bodies found. Just like those at the other site, it will be determined first off whether they were civilians or soldiers. Not that there's special treatment, but the count does total differently. And other citizens are agonizing over loved ones they may have lost or been separated from, along with the loss of their homes, belongings, everything in their world. It all changed overnight. We have heard of those too who have stood in defiance and who have fought back against Russian soldiers. In Kyiv, after Putin's more recent announcement, there are Ukrainian nationalists who feel his speech showed the lack of Russian progress, and they feel confident the Ukrainian military will be able to defend them. There are also those who believe Putin has no idea what to do anymore and is trying to scare people with the use of his words instead. And of course, the majority never imagined this happening where they live. Somehow, and thankfully, the brave Ukrainians have been able to either hold off Russian soldier advances, and in some cases have even taken areas back. Areas like Kherson, Kyiv, and the Crimean Peninsula, all which have had major turning points for the war. Most citizens just want to return to normal most of all, although normal will probably never be the same again. Now, for citizens over in Russia, we have talked a lot about how the people are doing in Ukraine, so what about those over in Russia? We've touched on it here and there, and now we can take a closer look, especially now after President Putin approved the partial mobilization, at this time requiring anyone with prior military experience or those with specific skill set to enlist in the army. Since Putin's latest announcement, there have been a variety of responses from Russian nationals. Some are protesting, with more than 1,300 being arrested just hours after Putin's televised speech. Others are rushing to leave Russia. According to reports, flights filled quickly and ticket prices skyrocketed. However, we have to take into account the other side of the public. According to CarnegieEndowment.org, public support for the special operation remains impressive, and the Levada Center's May survey, the number of respondents who definitely support the special operation was little under half, with the strongest support coming from the 55-plus age group. Another 30% rather support the war, and over the course of a month, the number of respondents who are pausing to think has grown by 8 percentage points. And now those are indicators that deserve more attention than the infamous 80%, cited both those who consider all Russians moral degenerates and those who use sociology to justify the continued archaization of political regime. Presidential Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov stated, "Those who have left Russia blame those who have stayed behind for everything, even those who oppose the regime. Meanwhile, those who remain in Russia challenge their critics to return home and conduct civil and political resistance in the face of brutal police dictatorship." Now moving on to another part of Europe, in Spain, the Mar Menor Lagoon has a new appointment: personhood. That's right, the Mar Menor is a protected area off southeast Spain and is separated from the Mediterranean by a 13-mile sandbar. Over the years, the pollution has massively increased due to poor sewage systems, fertilizers, and discharging from mining services and activities. The area has gotten so bad that at one point, 85% of its vegetation was killed off. This new law will afford it special protection as approved by Congress in July and ratified by Spain's Senate on Wednesday, the first time such a measure had been approved in the country. Now, this legislation creates the legal basis for the lagoon's right to exist as an ecosystem and to evolve naturally, and it recognizes its right to protection, conservation, and restoration. The lagoon, which stretches a total of 994 square miles, and the nearby Mediterranean coastline, will now be legally represented by a group of caretakers made up of local officials, local citizens, and scientists who work in the area. Just kind of curious, why do we need laws to be able to take care of something? The initiative follows something similar elsewhere that have seen bodies of water in Ecuador, Colombia, and India granted legal privileges. Can it just be human nature to take care of what's around us all the time? Anyhow, we take you over to another area. Let's head over to Africa. Daniel has the report for you.
Thank you, Tiff. Now, in other news, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, met with President Joe Biden in an effort to open up dialogue about the war in Ukraine, along with other strategies. Ramaphosa's visit to Washington comes just weeks after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made his own trip to South Africa and promised that the administration will do more to listen to Africa. Ramaphosa himself tweeted he was there to talk about strengthening the relationship between South Africa and the U.S. Now, South Africa has been one of the countries abstaining from calling the war an invasion, and has previously warned other countries the sanctions on Russia will eventually hurt them as well. Topics of discussion during the meeting included the climate, global health, and peace and security measures, and about getting more companies to invest in South Africa to create jobs. The U.S. has remained steadfast. They are not trying to get South Africa to take sides. In a little twist, Ramaphosa himself is facing charges back home in South Africa regarding not reporting a burglary to police and effectively taking care of the criminals himself. It's kind of a no-no. There is also a question of where the money the burglar stole came from. Ramaphosa claims it's legit, but I guess we'll see. Now moving to the Middle East. First up in Iraq, the famous Tigris River is drying up and is just at 35% of its average water level. You may have heard of the Tigris River and its twin, the Euphrates River. It was the river that is said to have watered the biblical Garden of Eden and helped give birth to civilization itself. The Tigris and the Euphrates established Mesopotamia. You remember that from history? And I mean, the river it was a center point for civilization many, many years ago. And due to, well, humans, of course, and the fact that their climate in that area drastically shifts and is a hotspot for natural disasters, the Tigris's water flow has been partly cut off by dams and failing rainfall. Some even believe Turkey may be holding water in its dams, drastically reducing the flow into Iraq. Now, consequently, authorities have reduced cultivated areas out of necessity, which equaled pretty much half of their normal cultivation. Iraq has faced and continues to face political and security issues, leaving much less time to focus on their environment. Next, in the Middle East, the leaders of Israel and Turkey may not be BFFs just yet, but at least they found some common ground. Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met this week just before the United Nations General Assembly occurs. This is a huge break for the two countries as they just re-established relations back in August. The reason for the disdain between the two surfaced back in 2008-2009 when the Gaza war was going on and Erdogan publicly condemned Israel's prime minister for Israel's policies on Palestine. Now, the issues between Israel and Palestine, well, that's a whole nother conversation. Anyhow, back to the story. After multiple attempts at reconciliation, the two countries finally have it right and hope to move forward in positive direction, strengthening their relationship. Now, in Iran, several Iranian cities have erupted in violence, having 3 dead so far after the death of Masha Amini, an Iranian woman who died while in custody of the authorities. She was only 22 years old and was arrested by the morality police for wearing the hijab improperly. The authorities have stated she died of pre-existing conditions. However, her family dispute those facts, and apparently so do many citizens who are taking it to the streets in protest. There have also been videos surfacing of other Iranian women cutting their hair, and the group Anonymous has also joined in. You may remember the group from the past years. They are an unknown and individual identity, but they come together in their form of protesting governments by shutting down or attacking the government websites. The Iranian government announced they believe some of the protesters were foreign and stated that the intervention by some embassies and foreign services can be clearly seen. We will report more on this story as it develops. Now we go over to the US and the Caribbean area. Mother Nature has struck in the form of Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic last Sunday. This has left an estimated 1 million homes and businesses in Puerto Rico without power. The hurricane, which is now at a Category 4, created massive damage and 8 people have died so far. When it made landfall in Puerto Rico, the results were devastating. Flooding, and with the rain, landslides were created. Winds peaked to 130 miles per hour as of yesterday, as Fiona heads over to Bermuda. Now, safe wishes to anybody that's impacted by the hurricane. Over in Central America, in Honduras, former First Lady Rosa Bonilla, who was the wife of former President Cordero Lobo, has been charged with fraud and sentenced to 14 years in prison. The cause for her sentencing was misappropriation of funds. This means she used money that was meant for a specific cause on personal items. In Bonilla's case, she spent just under $600,000 on personal credit card payments. her children's school fees, and real estate construction, instead of directing it towards the families of the children with low income. This was a retrial, as the first one had too many inconsistencies, and their Supreme Court ordered a new one to be held in a lower court. Now this just goes to show karma always comes around. Now we go back to you, Tiff, for the wrap up.
Thank you, Daniel. And in the U.S., the Federal Reserve is trying to sustain inflation rates and has decided to increase its rate already 2 times this year so far, equaling 2.25%, which are massive increases. 75 basis points to be exact each. And what is a basis point? Glad you asked. It is a standard measure for interest rates and other percentages in finance. It equals 1/100 of 1%. So, for example, if we start at 1% interest rate and it is raised by 25 basis points, it is now a 1.25% interest rate. Does that make sense? Well, because the inflation rate continues to be near a 40-year high, the Fed is likely to deliver a 3rd consecutive mega interest rate hike when they conclude after they concluded their policy-making meeting on Wednesday. And now what does that mean for the everyday person? Well, you should expect your costs to head even higher. And if you were looking to buy a home this year, maybe pause on that as interest rates sit around 6%, which again is at that 14-year high. Next up, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy lives on and helps give back by auctioning off items that belong to Ginsburg for children's charity. Among the collectibles is a judicial collar made of gold glass beads, the first time any of her signature neckwear will be available for purchase. And her neckwear was classic. I mean, I can literally picture it right now, no doubt, with all of her beautiful collars on. Here's a fun fact. In an event where she was speaking in 2020, Ginsburg stated she would receive a new collar at least once a week from fans around the world. Some other items of Ginsburg included a pair of opera glasses, a wooden gavel, artwork from her Washington Watergate apartment, and even some funnier pieces depicting Ginsburg as her famous nickname, the Notorious RBG. The auction will also have additional Ginsburg fashion pieces, including white handbag, a shawl, some scarves, and 2 sets of her fishnet lace gloves. I don't know about you, but that sounds like it should fetch a hefty price and hopefully create lots of funds to give to the kids. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, Jai reports on the United Nations, what it is, what it does, and why it's needed. Stay tuned.